I think the question about trust, in a way, says that more structured information probably wouldn't have made a great deal of difference. I think in the end, this 52% vote to leave is fully in the knowledge of what the Bank of England and the International Monetary Fund and the Treasury and, you know, the bulk of academics generally and big business all think. And I don't think that in not taking that on board and voting that way, people are then saying these experts don't know anything about the subjects they're experts in. What they are thinking is, I know it's going quite well for you and people like you. I don't think it follows that I need to go and vote for the status quo on Thursday because it doesn't feel like it's working well for me. And so that is the issue about sort of trust and identity. And in a way, more factual information would, I think, have worked especially well with the people who are already going that way, with the graduate group that got on board. Because I think this late deciding group were taking it really, really seriously. You know, they were also thinking, well, it's quite difficult, isn't it? And there are people I trust on both sides. You know, if you're a Conservative voter and you see members of the cabinet on both sides, you've lost some of your cues. And so when people are saying, I'm definitely going to look into it a bit more, and I was always interested, what are you going to do, what are you going to do? I think people probably watched one or two of those big BBC programmes or one of the debates and just seriously tried to process everything and decide which way they were going. And that is the question about the mystery of why would people take a risk in that way? And I think the Remain side and Downing Street are counting on this, and it's there in the evidence, and we saw it in Scotland, that there is a reversion back to the status quo in times of uncertainty. We don't see this. We see people just breaking equally on both sides of the question. Why doesn't it happen? I think what in the end happens are those voters who return to the ballot box, who are motivated by the fact they've got this choice. And I think they've clocked something about this vote, which is quite canny in a way, which is that for lots of times, politicians have been saying, we might have a referendum on that. I know some of you want one and other people aren't sure, but, you know, I think we should have one. And then the referendums don't happen because the treaty changes or the timing has changed. Tony Blair would have had one on the Euro or on the Lisbon Treaty. David Cameron was meant to have them, and they never happen. So I think especially those voters who turn out when they haven't voted since 1992, they're thinking, we're never going to be asked again. And that David Cameron is not engaged in an exercise of, I'm having this referendum because I want a new age of democratic participation in society. David Cameron is thinking about it in his own party and in the country. He's thinking about it as that moment in the wedding ceremony when you say, speak now or forever hold your truth. And therefore, he's sort of daring people. He's saying, you know it's a big risk, and people do know it's a risk. But if you don't jump now, actually, you will have had your say on sovereignty, on immigration. And so if you don't sort of break it now, you'll never get asked again. So I think that is quite a powerful motive to sort of seize the chance and take the risk for the voters who were torn on that side. And that's where I think, you know, he miscalculates what's going to happen.
I think for a lot of voters, they felt that getting control of borders, in a way they already felt that things were kind of out of control, so they wanted to gain some control by getting control of borders by voting out. So I would say that's probably the way the logic was unfolding for a lot of people. So in that sense, actually for them, the safe, continuous thing was to vote out. But you're right about this idea of risk-taking behavior, and some interesting work's been done by, I think, Paul Whiteley and Matthew Goodwin, where they've looked at the British election study, and in fact, or another study, and people who are more risk-taking in other parts of their lives, who are more willing to you know, I don't know, take a risk gambling or doing other kinds of behavior, those people were actually more likely to vote leave as well when you control for other kinds of cultural predispositions. So there was an extent to which the more risk-taking part of the population actually was somewhat more represented in the leave vote. And actually probably there were people who voted Remain who perhaps sympathized with many of the aims of the Leave campaign but just didn't want to take that risk. So the second question here on trust, I can't remember where that question came from. Over here, yes. So, yes, mistrust of elites and politicians is absolutely important. What I would say, the question that I would ask, not only of the Brexit vote but other votes, is why is that benefiting a right-wing populism rather than a left-wing populism. And in fact, what we find is even though how much do you trust Westminster and trust your local MP, that question does predict a little bit in terms of voting Brexit. It is nowhere near as important as your answer to values questions around immigration, the death penalty, so on. So lack of trust is an ingredient, absolutely, but I don't think it necessarily tells us a huge amount of which way the vote went. So.
I'd like to see more of this happen. I think different people will do it for different motives. If you're a trade union organiser and you look at the people you represent, you will already have that group, and it might be quite useful to start that conversation so that actually you can tell people we've got people on both sides and they're working together to protect this protection and so on. If you're one of the MPs, if you're Norman Lamb in Norfolk or Clive Lewis here or Chloe Smith, actually you've got a strong interest in doing it, because while there are some political projects such as UKIP or the Liberal Democrats that can probably fish very much at one edge of this debate, almost any MP who's going to get elected or any party is going to have to knit this together. So I think it would be quite good to see more people doing it, and obviously it's quite a challenging thing to do if you don't already have those relationships. There are some examples in the United States, and here I agree with Eric that the United States is considerably more polarised. Has been, I think, since 2000, is more so with Trump. And so if you think about blue state, red state America, Gore versus Bush, or especially Trump, that's probably a harder thing to do. And there are some examples of people doing this. There's an academic called John Haidt who's written about this. There's a project called the Civility Project, and people just sit around and, very safely moderated and discuss their concerns and views about the country as strong Republican or strong Democrat voters. And very few people change their minds and switch to the other party or change all of their views. But they do come out of that, it seems, with a stronger sense of the humanity of the people who disagree with them and a stronger ability to understand that bit of motivating, which might make you a better partisan advocate for your side. And here I think real-world exchanges are rather different from online exchanges, which I think can have the opposite effect. You become more sort of snarled and etc. because people just behave, I think, in a more reasonable way. And so some of the conversations we're having about immigration around the country are deliberately to make people engage civilly with people who take a different view and see if there's some give and take in that conversation.
If the question is indeed about immigration as a kind of value issue, I'm not sure why it's a value issue as such, but that would need discussing. But I think we really need to know more about what is hidden by this 40% that are saying they're voting one way because of immigration. As I was saying earlier, I mean, this immigration term covers at least three different kinds of populations, that some of whom are not immigrants. They're foreign nationals living in the UK who have a legal right to be treated with non-discrimination, effectively, which is what European citizenship is. It's a right of residence, so it's something anchored in a particular kind of post-national right. It's quite an abuse of their status to start calling them immigrants, and that's part of this problem. Part of it is that it's the people that Farage was portraying in his poster. The hordes of guys coming across the border in Slovakia or whatever, which is a kind of phantasm of refugees, which actually has very little to do with the EU, because the EU basically keeps the refugees out of Britain by dealing with them at the British border on French soil. And then, as we're also seeing, it's mixed in with this kind of this discourse about Muslims who are British citizens, who are not immigrants either, but an ethnically distinct British group that are being reassociated with immigration because of the UKIP politics. So I one of the points is this is coming up also, the work of Catherine de Vries at Essex, who's doing comparative work on this and showing the same sorts of figures across countries. We need, as scholars, I think, to be a lot more careful about the language that we're using to describe particular categories of population. And as I know, Eric, you have an interest in the notion of political demography. I mean, political demography is also very much about the way in which national units are created out of populations and according to territories. And what Britain has been voting on, I think, has been also its conception of itself as a population, and as a population within within a larger political unit that it now wants to secede from.
We've conducted a couple of big studies of immigration attitudes after the referendum, including carrying out some polling immediately afterwards to find out where people are. And the interesting thing, of that 40% of people who are expressing concerns about it, you've got very different people in that group, and then other people who've got views about it, even if there isn't, one of their big issues. So for a small group of people, having concerns about immigration means, stop it all, and stop as much of it as possible. And if you could send some of it away as well, they would do that. But I would characterise that as something that those are the views of about maybe about half of the UKIP vote. 1 or 2 million of the 4 million UKIP voters, and the other half of the UKIP vote resembles the Labour and Conservative voters who say immigration's a very big issue for me, and then other voters for whom it's an issue but not the biggest issue. And what we found is that just quite nuanced views of exactly what you're talking about there if we ask people different kinds of questions. So this is research immediately after the referendum. Should the 3 million Europeans who are here, should they all be guaranteed the right to stay? On that, 84% of people are saying yes, and 16 are saying no. No, I think 16 is a worryingly large.
The 3 million are completely invisible in Eric's data. He's showing data about the ethnic minorities in the UK
that's
that
right,
don't show any data at all about East Europeans.
So on the 3 million
which I
people,
think is the big issue here.
So on the 3 million people, what we're saying there is 75% of the Leave voters and 90% of the Remain voters are saying that would be the right thing to do. So I'm worried that 16 is a higher number than I'd want, but actually 84 is not a bad number to work with. If we say, are you worried about the numbers of unskilled, low-skilled workers from Eastern Europe, would you reduce that in future? Then 65% are saying yes to that. But that's falling to a quarter and a fifth for skilled workers or students. And if you actually attach job titles to things, then people have very different views. So only a quarter of people reduce the number of people who come to work in care homes. But more people would for people who come to work in hotels. Nurses, they certainly wouldn't. Hotels, they're not sure whether hotels are doing as much to train. So these quite nuanced views. What I'm really interested in is, can our politics now reflect what is actually quite a balanced set of public views? A quarter of people are very happy with the immigration we've got, and a quarter of people would sort of have as little of it as possible. Most of the population are in, I'd slow it down a bit, but I'd be very selective in what I would and wouldn't reduce. What would an immigration debate, an immigration policy look like that reflected actually where most of the voters on both sides are? And, there are a lot of people who vote Remain, who don't think freedom of movement in its full form is the right thing to do, but thought something else was more important. They're quite similar to these wasn't sure about it but ended up voting Leave voters. So there are concerns about immigration that are very moderate, as well as concerns about immigration that are very extreme.